Welcome to Itasca Waters Practical Water Wisdom Series. I'm Brian Whittemore, your host for today. We have another great program for you today, the importance and protection of wetlands in Minnesota. First, let me tell you a little bit about Itasca Waters. We are a local nonprofit headquartered in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, with members who either live and or vacation in our area. Our goal is to continue to find interesting ways to educate residents in Itasca County about how to keep our water clean for both the environment and the economy. We've been teaming up with like-minded people and organizations for 16 years now. You can read about those projects on our website at itascawaters.org. If you have an interest, please consider joining us and becoming a member or a volunteer to help support programs like this. And we thank our partners shown on your screen for their support in producing this program. Today's program will work the same as always. Our presenter will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll answer questions from you. To submit a question, you only need to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type in a brief question. And you can do this at any time, and we will read the questions on your behalf. We will not be using the chat function today. This program is being recorded and will be available for viewing online through our website, itascawaters.org. We value your opinion, so please click on the survey link, which will be on screen at the end of today's program, or complete the survey that will be sent to you by email. We thank you for doing that. Now, today's topic is the value of wetlands and the regulations that protect them. Our presenter is Jennie Skancke. David Demmer was scheduled to be here, but had to cancel due to a family situation, but David has contributed to today's program. Jennie Skancke has worked at the Minnesota DNR as a hydrologist and wetland scientist since 2012. Prior to that, she worked in the national parks of California. Her favorite state park is Mille Lacs-Catheo State Park, but her family also loves YMCA Camp de Nord near Ely. She lives in the Twin Cities with her daughter and Border Collie Rescue. David Demmer has worked for the Minnesota Board of Water Soil Resources since 2016 as a wetland specialist and co-coordinator of the Minnesota Wetland Professional Certification Program. Now, Jennie, it's all up to you. Thank you very much. Take it away.
Okay. Well, quick caveat, everybody. David was going to help me present. He's at the Board of Water and Soil Resources, and he wasn't able to make it. And I was on vacation, and he put together a bunch of the presentation. And so we may have a couple tiny hiccups like that. I think it might be where, I have to push the button a couple times before the components of the slide fall in and everything, which only shows up when you're doing it presentation mode. So we may have a little of that. I told David if I'm not able to present about his information regarding wetlands, then I shouldn't hold my position of wetland program manager at the DNR. So hopefully I'm able to talk in an educated manner about all of the slides that David put in here. And I think I'll have a little bit less presentation content, and maybe we'll just have a little more time for questions and answers and any kind of discussion that you might want to have. So with that, I'll get us started. So this actually came from a previous presentation that I gave called Minnesota Wetlands, the Ordinary and Extraordinary. So part of my position is working with our calcareous fens, which are a unique kind of groundwater fed wetland. They're very rare, and they cover about 0.01% of our state. But I'm actually not going to talk about them today. I should have changed the title. So my name is Jennie Skancke. Thank you very much for the introduction. I would say that my favorite part of working at DNR is working with partners like the local soil and water conservation districts. I got to do that a lot when I was an area hydrologist. And I love assisting people who have questions about wetlands or have a special interest in them. I take a lot of questions from landowners about wetlands on their property. So I'm glad to be here presenting to all of you today. I hope we'll have some questions and we can have some discussion beyond just what I'm presenting. So I'm going to step way back. I'm hoping that everybody knows what a wetland is, but from a scientific perspective, we have, a scientific description of what a wetland is. So wetlands are those areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, and that under normal circumstances do support a prevalence of vegetation and also these hydric soils. So even during drought conditions, you may see that the vegetation around a wetland might look a bit different, but because of that routine saturation, we would still find wetland soils there. So if you sent somebody out from year to year to collect the parameters that make up what a wetland is, we think that it would take many years before we would say, oh, this part is no longer a wetland. So it's this, there is fluctuation between years and even within a year, like we've seen lately. But the long-term inundation, and that might be just periodic inundation, causes these hydric soils. And it's all those things, the vegetation and the soils and the hydrology, that makes an area a wetland. Okay, so wetland work. Who's doing wetland work out in our lovely state of Minnesota? This is how you can find me. I'm going to talk a little bit just briefly about the kind of work that I do. If you just Google Minnesota DNR wetlands, you'll come up to our Minnesota DNR wetlands page, and we've got a bunch of information about the projects that we're working on at Minnesota DNR, some reports on there. And at the very bottom, not shown on my slide, but at the very bottom is my email and my phone number. And, anybody's welcome to call me or email me at any time if you have any questions. And most recently, with our status and trends monitoring, we put a report out and a little news release, and it was picked up by a lot of the media. And we had this lovely report that was in NPR News. We had a story on WCCO, which was very exciting. And I think an upcoming story in Outdoor News too. So that's fun to get a little bit of press for our wetlands in Minnesota. We do what's called the status and trends monitoring, where we fly over about 4,000 sites every 3 years. So we have a certain part of the state that gets flown 1 year, and then the next year and the next year, and we repeat that every 3 years. And then we're able to interpolate that data. We're able to look at it and say, oh, this is wetland area. And we categorize by acreage, and through a scientific process, we extrapolate and say, okay, we've seen some wetland gains over the last 10 years. That's what our wetland report said. And it's not a total inventory of all the acreage of wetlands across Minnesota, but it's a way to collect data from plots. And then you say, there's been this increase in wetland acreage. And we saw some level of correlation between precipitation and that increase in wetland acres over that 10-year period that we looked at. But that doesn't mean that we had more precipitation and so our wetlands grew in area. It maybe means that we had some wet years, and so some more people put their land into an easement or something like that, or perhaps there was a wetland in a farm field and the farmer said, okay, I'm going to stop cropping in that area. And so then when we flew those flights, it showed up as wetland. So generally, like I said, wetlands don't fluctuate really with their boundary. On a wetter year, of course, we're going to see a bigger extent of open water. So in any case, if you're really interested, if you're very geeky about wetlands like me, you can go to this page and read all about the work that we're doing. So David, who is going to be my partner in presenting today, he's over at the Board of Water and Soil Resources, and I'll talk a little bit more about his work now. Well, not quite yet. So I want to today show you guys some resources. What I get the most from the public are these calls that say, I have a wetland on my property. What can I do with it? And it's not so easy as that, because in Minnesota we have many layers of regulation and many different kinds of wetlands. So we have what we call the National Wetlands Inventory Wetland Finder. So if you went to Google and you Googled Minnesota DNR Wetland Finder, you'd come up with this web tool. And there are different ways that you can classify wetlands, and you can choose here. So I'm showing the simplified plant inventory here. So it's like, what kind of wetlands are they? Are they a coniferous wetland that has coniferous trees? Is it a deep marsh, the kind that you really think of with those big prairie potholes where there's open water and then there's like the cattails on the end? So here I'm showing the area just north and west of Minneapolis, and you can see lots of the blue. So the shallow open waters, our lakes, obviously, the deep marshes, the shallow marshes, that's just like the regular water level fluctuation. And then, of course, you'll probably know, as you move further north, down here on the bottom right of my slide, you can see Upper and Lower Red Lake, and you've got all that peatland up north. So Minnesota has some of the biggest expanses of peatlands in the world, which is amazing and can be a huge resource for us. I could give you guys a whole presentation about peatlands. But just, it really shows the difference across our huge state of Minnesota. We have so many different kinds of wetlands. A lot of people, especially hunters, they really think about our prairie potholes. That's where a lot of Ducks Unlimited focuses a lot of their funding to restore some of those prairie potholes, or sometimes on the federal lands, the Fish and Wildlife Service, they'll do water level management of those prairie pothole wetlands so that they can really manage for water levels that are best for waterfowl to come in and do their nesting, especially these wet years that we've had. Those ducks and the waterfowl don't necessarily like those really high water levels where we don't have a lot of areas for them to nest. So they do that a lot on their federal lands. We do that a little bit on our state wildlife management areas too. All right, so what are wetland functions and values? That's how we talk about them in the scientific community. Like, why am I here talking to you guys about this? What good are wetlands? A lot of people will say, oh, that's a swamp area, or, you know, there's a lot of different words for wetlands. I've been working with my 8-year-old to make sure that we don't call every wetland a swamp area, that we know that there are wetlands and they have a lot of amazing benefits. So we call the functions like the natural processes that happen. Like, some of them are really easy to also give a value to, like wetlands provide amazing flood protection, especially around metro areas, you know, where there's so much stormwater coming from streets. A lot of times in the metro, we had so many wetlands around here. A lot of times now the stormwater routes through our wetlands. It's really rare to find a wetland around the Twin Cities metro area that doesn't receive stormwater. So that can end up polluting the sediment, because that's another function that wetlands serve. They can take those nutrients out of that water and sequester it in their soils. What are the values? So that's like, what value is that to me? One of the things that we've been talking about a lot at the state is the climate change value of wetlands. So wetlands can sequester carbon, especially our peatlands are incredible at sequestering carbon and then holding it in those peatlands. And if they dry, like through ditching, they will release greenhouse gases. So there's been a lot of work recently about trying to quantify which wetlands and what's needed to make sure we're sequestering that carbon, but not releasing it in equal amounts so that they can be a real benefit for us when we're doing all of that accounting, like are we meeting our climate change goals? Our governor, Governor Walz, has been one of the first governors, I would say the first governor to really make a push towards those national climate goals. He has committed Minnesota to be a part of the governor's climate alliance of states. So there's about 25 states. Imagine that we're such a divided nation. About 25 states that are part of that climate alliance of states. So we've been really looking at our what we call our natural and working lands, which are those mainly the publicly owned lands where we can use land management to achieve certain climate goals. So that is using a function to achieve a value. So lots and lots of other functions, which I've got on the next slide here. This is just one example of a kind of wetland where you've got water that comes from streams or rivers, and if it flows through a wetland and into another stream, that wetland can dissipate the energy. So then you don't get as much erosion. This also happens like if there are wetlands on the side of the stream, if the stream can achieve reaching its floodplain, that can really dissipate a lot of energy. That's of value, so that we're not sending all of that sediment to our big rivers that then goes to the Mississippi and et cetera. It gets carried through the system, and sediment can be a really expensive thing to deal with, especially for the Army Corps when they dredge it out of the Mississippi River. So that is a quantifiable value. So lots of other things that wetlands do, which is one of the reasons, of course, that I love them. One of the most common would be providing habitat, especially for our waterfowl in those prairie pothole wetlands. Shoreline protection, probably some of you are lakeshore owners, and you may have a little bit of wetland, hopefully along your shoreline. You'll find that you'll get like less wave erosion. Around here in the metro especially, we've really seen like the big boats. You guys, I can't even think of the name for those big boats, but the ones that create the big waves, landowners that have some wetlands or some vegetation along the shoreline really fare a lot better at not losing their land to those big waves. So we call that a value of wetlands as well. Here are just a few more. These are like, what I'm showing here is just a bunch of the different kinds of wetlands that exist out there in our state. Sometimes we have groundwater that's in aquifers and it's under pressure and it's being pushed up and it's feeding wetlands. Like those are the ones that we call our fens. There are big areas that have held water for a long time and then that becomes peat. Those are our bogs. Sometimes there are wetlands that are not connected to groundwater, like there might be a layer of clay underneath. Those are our depressional wetlands, like the prairie potholes, et cetera. I think you probably get the idea. So there's lots of ways to display that when we're making permitting decisions. Like at the Minnesota DNR, we permit well use, so the water use that folks pump from their wells, and we're required to look at whether that pumping will cause impacts to adjacent resources and also adjacent domestic wells, et cetera. Minnesota is so incredibly diverse that we oftentimes have to look at existing private wells because those show us what are all of the layers of geology and how connected is that groundwater to our wetlands. And if somebody, say a farmer or something, is going to pump a lot of water for irrigation, we want to know first, are they going to impact any private wells around them? Second, are they going to impact any resources like what I said at the beginning, a calcareous fen that has a lot of threatened and endangered plants in there? All right, like I said, Minnesota is an incredibly complex state for regulation and for preservation programs. And I think partly that's because we've got quite a bit of money to put forward for especially preservation, but also across the board, whatever political party, our legislature has just always considered our water resources. And I think as a representation of what the public cares about, right? We care about our water resources. It's part of our identity, our lakes and our wetlands and our peatlands. It's one of the things that we really love about Minnesota. So our legislature has always put a lot of money forward towards preservation, like the Reinvest in Minnesota program, where folks can set aside some of that land that say may not be as productive, and they can restore that to wetlands, and they put that in a permanent easement. But regulatory wise, we have all of these agencies. We've got the Minnesota DNR, the Board of Water and Soil Resources, the Army Corps, who regulates also. They sometimes overlap regulation with us, perhaps a little less so now that there's been a difference made through the Supreme Court. We're reclassifying what are called waters of the US, or WOTUS, you'll hear it called in the news. So one lovely thing for folks who are nervous about the protection of water resources, that those are going to be decreased because of the Supreme Court ruling, is that we have really a lot of state regulation. So we think we're going to be pretty well off here in Minnesota. We shouldn't see too many changes. Unfortunately, what we may see is like adjacent states that don't have those state regulatory programs. We're a little nervous about, those ducks and waterfowl don't just come directly to Minnesota. They can't, they're not going to just pop over from North Dakota or whatever necessarily. So we're a little nervous about our adjacent states and whether there might be wetland changes because of the lack of or the reduced regulation by the Army Corps. So very complex. It's been in the news a lot lately. And at one point, the legislature asked us to look into doing some consolidation of the agencies, but I haven't seen that seems to be a feasible option. So we'll keep it as it is. Everybody's got their lane, and we do really good collaboration. There's the Pollution Control Agency, which regulates pollution, like water quality. They monitor water quality of the state, etc. This is just a little bit of a complex slide to show when you've got a wetland, you have these edges of a wetland, and the middle part is what we classify as a public water. So water bodies, including lakes and some wetlands of a certain size. At one point in the 80s, we developed a map and said, these are going to be public waters. So any physical impacts to those waters are going to be regulated and permitted through the DNR. So when there's a wetland, the DNR will regulate these impacts below what we call the ordinary high water. If any of you live on a lake, you probably know what your ordinary high water level is. It's pretty commonly known. And then on the edges is what's regulated through the local government unit through the Wetland Conservation Act. That's what David was going to talk about from the Board of Water and Soil Resources. So in Minnesota, even though we like a lot of protection for our resources, we also like to keep things local. So all of that's done at the local government unit. So I don't think I'm going to spend much time on this, except to say that the Wetland Conservation Act, it's administered by the local government unit. There are these group of people who provide oversight to the local government unit because of that because it's being really regulated locally, there can sometimes be what looks like a little bit of a conflict of interest, but we have what's called the TEP, the Technical Evaluation Panel. And whenever somebody's proposing to do something like fill a wetland to put in an apartment building or something like that, the TEP reviews that to make sure that they have looked for the lowest impact solution. Like, could they move their apartment building to avoid that wetland? And anybody on that TEP can say, I disagree with this decision. And then, if they do disagree, that has to be documented. And then everybody on that TEP also has the right to appeal that decision if they really feel like it was a bad decision by the local government. So like I said, DNR regulates public waters. What the heck is a public water? We developed these maps a long time ago. I want to let you all know that there was a time where folks could weigh in when we were developing that map. So sometimes in a state, there may be a wetland or a stream that somebody would think, that seems like it should have been on our public waters map, but there was local governments who disagreed, and so sometimes they don't make them on there, put them on there. But we have this webpage if you're interested in any more about that. I don't think I want to talk much about our permitting program. It's essentially if you're going to make a change to a stream or a lake, like you're going to do some dredging or you're going to put in a culvert or a bridge, the DNR will do a permit for that sort of thing. And then we have our conservation officers who go out and respond to any potential violations, either even if it's not under DNR jurisdiction, even if it's regulated by the local government unit, that's still the DNR conservation officers who would go out and check that everything's on the up and up. Not going to spend any time on that. I do want to say to you all, we have what are called the area hydrologists out in every area. I put a link here to that map that's continuously updated if that changes. And those area hydrologists have really close relationships with all of their counties and their cities, et cetera. And they oftentimes know exactly what's going on everywhere in the county. And if you have any questions at all, you can call them. And another amazing resource, of course, is the Soil and Water Conservation District. Those guys, I feel like they know everybody who owns a piece of property in any given county. So just this is what I talked about a little bit earlier. It's called our wetland finder. You can look on here and you can just find out these little hash marks. Those are what we call public waters. So that's where the DNR would be involved. And then all these other colored areas, those are also wetlands, but those are wetlands that would be really regulated at the local government unit. All right, and then when there are public waters, you all might be a little bit interested in this, there's what's called shoreland. So our bigger public waters have what's also called a shoreland classification. And those water bodies, that shoreland classification has to go in a local government unit's ordinance. And the ordinance can be more restrictive about things like impervious surface or structure setbacks, but they can't be less restrictive than what is in state statute. And that area hydrologist reviews those ordinances whenever anything's being changed to make sure that every city or county is meeting the minimum requirements. So if you're ever interested in having a really strong voice about things that could impact if you live on a lake or just if you care about water quality, those shoreland ordinances and floodplain ordinances really guide a lot that goes on. So there's just another slide about that. Sorry, I forgot that I had that in there, but I looked up Itasca County, and there is a unique map viewer of all the parcels in Itasca County. It shows which areas are floodplain. It shows how they're zoned. It does not show what I thought it might, which is what is the classification system for the water bodies? So then you'd have to go, I put a link in here to our map, which says like, oh, this is a general development lake. Those get a shorter setback. So gosh, I'm not even sure what it is. I think 75 or 50 feet. And then the natural environment lakes get a bigger setback because they were designated along with the county to say, we want to have bigger protections on these lakes. All right, last slide, y'all, and then we'll go to some questions. I just want to make sure everybody knows we also have jurisdiction over folks when they're managing the aquatic vegetation along shorelines, and that is through our fisheries department because those native vegetation along shoreline really are very important fisheries habitat. So that's through what I have here, our aquatic plant management. So again, you could Google Minnesota DNR aquatic plant management and you'd come here, and it's a really easy permit to get, but there are some regulations you can clear, like 50 feet or an area around your dock, etc. And then we also have this conservation officer location tool where if you need to call in an anonymous tip about something that you think shouldn't be happening, you can reach a conservation officer there. But again, you can also reach out to the area hydrologist, and you can reach out to the Soil and Water Conservation District. They're all tied together and they talk to each other probably daily. So I'm going to leave it, I think, at that. Yep. I'm going to leave it at that. And I hope I've got some time for questions. It looks like 12:30. So I could talk about wetlands.
Okay, Jenny, thank you very much. Well done. Now let's go to the Q&A portion of today's program, and it'll be hosted by Bill Granges, the director of the Itasca County AIS program and a longtime Itasca Waters board member. Bill, all yours.
Thank you, Brian. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first question and answer section for this year, our third year. Remember that you're going to submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A icon. We've gotten some really fantastic questions submitted by our audience so far. We're not going to use the chat function. Now, I'm going to try and get through all these questions. If we don't get to your question, please feel free to email us and we'll try and get you an answer.
Yeah,
Okay,
you're
Jenny.
welcome to email me directly as well. I put my email up on that last slide.
Thank you. Okay, so Jenny, our first question. Wow. Okay, first question. The New Range copper nickel proposed mine at Tamarack, Minnesota is a wetland that drains through Big Sandy Lake to the Mississippi River. How is this important Tamarack wetland going to be preserved from acid mine drainage, since the wetland will actually be dug up by an open pit mine? I'm not debating the need for copper nickel mining, but more focus on how to protect the wetland from the output of the mine operation.
Yeah, boy, that's a big one to start with. So I think it goes back a little bit to our layers of protection that we have in Minnesota. So at the Minnesota DNR, when there are big projects like these mines, the DNR actually acts as that local government unit for regulating and making sure that those wetland impacts are mitigated for. So they work with those developers to come up with an agreeable solution. And I would say in Minnesota, they're probably held to a lot higher standards than some other states. And of course, there's also the Minnesota Pollution Control, who has a permit to deal with the actual water quality impacts of that drainage. I think I'm hoping that we are learning that our climate is really changing, and when some of these big mines are having to put in certain mitigative components, I would suggest if you're going to any sort of a public meeting or something, one thing to advocate for, in my opinion, is that our mines are held to higher standards. So we can look back at 30 years and have an average amount of precipitation. But what we're seeing is we're getting these big precipitation events. And that means, if we get 7 inches at once, a basin may not be designed to withstand that kind of an event. They might be designed to withstand a 2-inch event that happens over a month, multiple times over a month. So that's one thing I'm hoping that we're starting to think about are those big events. I think that can really be, I've seen in the news, an area where problems can arise if those tailings basins can't handle like flooding events, that sort of thing. But I haven't been personally too involved in that because our lands and minerals, they handle only all of that mining stuff. So they put in place all these monitoring conditions, etc. But if anybody has any questions, I could definitely put them in touch with somebody, but reasonable concerns for sure.
Terrific. That was a heck of a first question. Okay, second question, again from an anonymous person here. FTAC, now UTAC, is permitted by the DNR to expand tailing storage and are planning to build on top of a peat bog without an EIS. Why are they getting to take this 1,200 acres of peat bog without a review and public comment?
Mm. I am not going to be able to answer that one at all. I haven't been involved in that process. There are unique statutes in place for these big mines that allow unique mitigation strategies. So I would imagine sometimes what's happened is that mines might own another property that then they give over to the state as a mitigation, but I really couldn't say the intricacies of that specific one.
Okay, fair enough.
And I'd probably get in trouble if I did say,
No.
but I honestly don't know.
Okay, next question. Headwaters drain through our wetland into our lake. Phosphates enter the lake through this streamlet. To attempt to reduce the phosphate output of the cedar wetland, is it better to make the water move through the wetland more slowly or to move through more directly and more quickly? Specifics on site will matter, but is there a general thought about how wetlands produce or reduce phosphate output?
Yeah, that is such an interesting question because it's been a little bit a matter of debate recently. I saw a project recently come across my desk where instead of sending the water slowly through the wetland, a watershed district was proposing to put rocks around a channel so that the water actually doesn't go through the wetland, because there is some question about, well, is it releasing more nutrients if it goes more dispersed through the wetland? I think that the answer is pretty nuanced. I think it really depends on the type of wetland, the timing of it. Sometimes in this case in particular, the wetland was pretty small and on the side of a road. So if the traveling time of those nutrients, if that water flow is able to take a long time before it gets to the lake, you're probably going to see more of it getting absorbed and stored in those sediments. If it's really short, like in this case, I'm thinking of, there was a big culvert, water's coming off of the road, it's going through the culvert. Even though it's going through the wetland, it might be so fast that it's pulling those nutrients through. So probably in that case, it actually does make sense to send the water just along a channel. But what you then might see is transport of, say, salt and sand. Like, especially one of the big concerns we've had recently is chloride that can get washed into the lake. You might see a change in how the water level bounces in the lake. So yeah, competing interests and case by case.
Very good. Next question. This is from Karen, longtime contributor to our program. Hi, Karen. Knowing that peat bogs store enormous amounts of carbon in a process called carbon sequestration, are peat bogs and peatlands still being harvested as an energy source?
Yeah, I didn't even plant you out there, Karen, for that question. It's my favorite topic. So we do permit peat harvesting similar to how we permit other kinds of mining. However, we are having discussions for sure about where and how to target that peat harvesting because, like you said, our peatlands not only sequester but store so much carbon. So if we can harvest peat from an area that has already been influenced by like prior drainage or something like that, where there's a ditch going through, and so that peat's already drying, that's a much better place to take that peat from. And then my understanding from our lands and minerals folks is, um, there are mitigative strategies, there can be restoration, but the establishment of peat is a really long process, and over that long time frame, they're pulling that carbon in and storing it. So the bang for the buck per se is to preserve those peatlands where that carbon is, because gosh, you're not going to see that carbon captured again by those peatlands for a really long time. So I think we have to put like a monetary value almost on, we're not going to recapture that carbon in 20 years. It's going to be 1,000 years or something like that. So is it really worth disturbing an area? It's not like sometimes, you can farm through a small wetland and you can restore that in a couple years. But with our peatlands, that's not the case.
Very good. Next question comes from Jessica. How could a dredging project impact a lake, even if the proper precautions are put in place?
Well, in the metro especially, we'll see dredging projects where they want to remove some contaminated sediments, especially phosphorus and nitrates. And you can see a kind of a long recovery time. So I think one of the biggest reasons, of course, is to try to improve the water clarity, because you'll get all that growth that's happening. I would bet that all of you understand there are these invasive species aquatics, but then there are also a lot of aquatic plants out there that are really beneficial for not only like fish habitat and just the macroinvertebrate habitat and the whole food web of a lake or wetland, but for nutrient processing as well. So when you're dredging, you're also, it's such a fine balance between, you might stir up that sediment and you might release it. So a lot of times, if there's a way to lower the water level first and then pull that sediment out, you don't get so much of the sediment that gets released into the water table. So for sure, I think there can be real benefits for removing some of those nutrients, but then also it's a pretty disturbing process as well.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, Kurt asks, I know there has been discussion about this, but are there plans for the state to create a delineated wetland layer from consultants? Some counties and states have GIS layers for these.
Yeah. So there is what I showed, the National Wetland Inventory. That
Mhm.
is a flown layer where we fly with the LiDAR and elevational, and that's an approximate boundary. You can find that on our wetland finder if you just do Minnesota DNR wetland finder. But our technology has not kept up as much with when a delineator goes out and measures the actual
Mhm.
more precise boundary. Like it oftentimes happens when somebody wants to put a house or something, and then the county might need to know, well, where's the edge of the wetland, because you have to be X amount of feet back from the wetland. So right now there's no system in place. There's a desire to have a system in place where that's
Mhm.
digital. We just haven't kept up, especially with funding. One thing that we struggle with at the state level really is our IT people, and just I think one, just not having the ability to pay folks enough to be an IT person at the state because they're so high in demand, and then just not having enough of them. So I think it'll happen hopefully in the next 5 years. Hopefully.
Very good. You see me smiling. It's you mentioned IT, and I just have to smile because it's everything nowadays. It revolves around our IT, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Very, very important. Next question is from Wesley. Is the DNR aware of how many threatened wetlands there are in northeast Minnesota?
I'm wondering what he means by threatened.
Wes, if you want to type a follow-up in that, we can loop back to this if we have time. How about that?
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, I think the general answer is our regulations are really strong. So, except for those big mining projects, you generally don't see those huge impacts from anything. Um, yeah, for sure there are different
Okay.
kinds of impacts.
All right. We'll see if we can't loop back to that later. Next question comes, in my area, ditches made of loamy soil and native plants and habitats are being replaced with asphalt trails. The surrounding area is replaced with curbs, black soil, boulders, and plastic laced straw. The natural ditches had much better drainage than the replacement. Why not mimic nature rather than overmanage, which often leads to a worse complication of drainage? Is this a matter of what the public is demanding?
Yeah, I think so. And one interesting thing about trails is that a lot of times the funding will come through the federal government, the same program that funds a lot of our roads. It's oftentimes a matching program. And then there are certain standards. So even though we might not need a 10-foot wide trail, it's a requirement under the grant program. And then there are regulations in place that if you're going to put that amount of impervious surface, you also have to route that to an area, but it can't necessarily be a natural area.
Sure.
I think they seem to understand pretty well that there are some real issues around.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Actually, just before this started, I had a call from a friend of mine that normally grooms trails up here, snowmobile trails, and they're really not doing it. And things are thawing out, which can cause problems, especially going over wetlands. Okay.
No?
Next question. Simple one. How is road salt affecting wetlands in northern Minnesota?
You know, I so the impacts of chloride from road salt are mainly being studied at the Pollution Control Agency. I've noticed that over the last few years, there's been a real push to better understand the long-term effects. And you all probably have seen it as well. There's a real big push to talk to people about reducing, and there are some cool programs, I think mainly led by MnDOT, um, to train the more local road salt applicators and about like well, at this temperature, you might as well not put salt down because it's not going to do anything. So can we reduce at certain times? I've noticed MnDOT's doing that, which is great. It's hard for us as Minnesotans because we don't want to
Sure.
we don't want to compute that even if they put salt down, it wouldn't work. But I think we're starting to transition to more of the salt and sand. So
Very good.
there is, I think if you were to Google like Minnesota PCA road salt, you'd come up with a big page of information.
Very good. Well, our time is drawing short, but I think we have enough time for another question, maybe two. Well, here's one for people in Minnesota. Which wetlands produce the most mosquitoes?
Oh my gosh. Last spring was such a crazy mosquito year. I have not been able to discern like which is the worst area. I just know that I do not want to go out into a wetland in May. Um, I honestly couldn't really say for sure. Around the metro here, we have like a whole mosquito control system where they fly helicopters around, but wouldn't
Okay.
that be good to know?
All right. We have one last question here. And this is from Glenn. Thank you, Glenn. Wetlands can vary from open water to moss-covered swamp with tamarack and black spruce. Any idea of the time frame in northern Minnesota for open water to be changed naturally to a moss-covered swamp? Each has ecological benefits, but one is dramatically more diverse and beneficial than the other type of wetland.
Yeah, right. Beneficial, I would say different values, right? Different functions and values. For sure, more beneficial to have these peatlands climate wise and probably nutrient wise. More beneficial to have these shallow water areas for waterfowl and for
Sure,
recreation, etc. It's something I'm personally really interested in because as we're out there, we have a wetland monitoring program that we're working on. You'll see these sort of more basin type
mhm,
wetlands where there might be a natural outflow barrier, like a little berm or something. And you'll see these wetlands that are in the in-between stage where there's like
mhm,
a peat layer that's
sure.
bouncy and underneath is water. And that whole mat will fluctuate up and down with the water levels. And I have not, I've actually done a lot of Googling about this subject and I have not found a lot of information about what does that time frame look like? And is it, of course, probably different in areas where the basin is not as deep? In some places, that peat layer can be like greater than 20 feet deep. It's that
Sure.
had to have taken a really long time. So,
Well, thank you for that, Jenny. And thank you, everyone, for all these fantastic questions. That's all we
yeah.
have time for today. So thank you for those great questions. Okay, Brian, let's go back to you.
All right, Bill, thank you very much. And a huge thank you to our speaker, Jennie Skancke. Really well done. And her collaborator, David Demmer. Make sure you register for our next Water Wisdom program coming up on March 7th to learn more about living with zebra mussels. If you would like to watch this program again or recommend it to your family, friends, or neighbors, a recording of today's talk will soon be on our website, itascawaters.org, along with all the previous programs from 2022 and 23. Now, we would love to get your feedback, so click on the survey link, which will be on screen at the end of today's program. You will also be getting an email evaluation form from Itasca Waters, so you can choose how you'd like to respond. We would really appreciate hearing from you. I'm Brian Whittemore, and thanks for being with us today. We'll see you on March 7th.
Thanks everybody for coming.